All right, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm live with you from Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitrov, who's live from Phoenix at the owners' meetings, and we are an hour different than what we thought we'd be because I forgot that the great state of Arizona, at least like part of it, it's not even like the whole state, doesn't observe daylight savings time. So back when you and I were gallivanting around Phoenix for the Super Bowl, it was mountain time. Now it's Pacific time. So Thomas is like, look, it's 3 p.m. where Thomas is. You're looking great, Thomas. How you doing?
I'm so happy to be here for a couple days. It was impromptu. I never think about the shows. I think about the shows all the time, but when I'm planning, I don't think about it. And then all of a sudden I'm thinking, wow, we need to make sure that we are in line here. I have about, I don't know, 10 appointments set up at the Biltmore. Again, just so everyone knows, I'm at a place called the Valley Ho. The Valley Ho, believe it or not, there's a place called the Valley Ho in Phoenix, in Scottsdale. Really, really cool retro place. I think back in the day, guys like Frank Sinatra and all the Brat Pack used to stay in this area here, right? And then the Biltmore is where all the owners are. It's where all the GMs are. It's where I have appointments tonight. But I figured I'm going to stay here right now, do this pod with you clean, so I don't have to find a place at the Biltmore to like tuck in a corner, and I can yell and not have former owners like Arthur Blank walking by me thinking, what the hell is Dimitrov doing here in the corner making a loud.
Well, luckily, unlike me, who has a voice that will make people in the next room kind of come over and complain to the landlords, you at least have like a very like sort of good tone there that you could at least pull it off. When I was at the Super Bowl, I was teaching a class. I had to go to like the coffee shop to do it. And people kind of looking at me like I'm insane. You would get stares for a different reason, but this is kind of an interesting time, right? Because you have free agency is mostly all finished. We're going to talk about a few guys today. The NFL draft is in about a month. In fact, basically a month from today. And so it's kind of a natural time for everybody to get together. Thomas, there's sort of like just a brief summary of like what goes on when folks get together at these meetings?
So we call them league meetings / owners meetings. We always used to call them owners meetings, and we used to call them like the big boy meetings, right? When you graduate to being a general manager from being a middle management guy, you're at the big boy table with your owner and with your head coach, and there is a lot going on there. If sometimes I think they have certain TV stations or footage of it. I don't know if it's NFL films. It's pretty amazing when you watch it. You see all of the big hitters with all their opinions coming out. Some you would expect to be more opinionated, others not. It's really amazing to listen to owners opine on certain things. Then a head coach will get up and have his opinion, and every once in a while a GM will. Here's the interesting thing: 30 years ago, the GMs were really stout, right? They were up there pounding the table. The George Youngs of the world, the Ernie Accorsi's, all of that group. The GMs have taken a step back a little bit. It's usually the owners and the head coaches. I've been pushing over the last few years, even before I was let go. We need more presence from general managers. And I say that great due respect to everyone. The GMs have so much knowledge in this league. I've said this many times. They need to share them. They need to share their opinions and their experiences with the owners. The owners don't just need to go and listen to the head coaches. You need to listen to both. It's a really, really important part of the evolution of the league.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so much, there are some long tenured head coaches right now. You think of Andy Reid, you think of John Harbaugh, you think of Mike Tomlin, just to name a few. But, a lot of head coaches are somewhat transient, right? Like, you have guys, even Andy Reid has been from one team to the next. Mike McCarthy's been on two teams before. You have some, sort of oscillation, right? Like, Frank Reich is in year one of being with Carolina after years in Indianapolis. Whereas general managers, there's often like if you do have success there, you're going to be at that organization for a long time. So there's some institutional knowledge that maybe a head coach doesn't necessarily have because it is more of a position where you can sort of move different teams, whereas general manager, is a position where, especially of late, it's your one job, your one opportunity at least. We're trying to change that now, obviously, at Sumer, being obviously a company where we want to provide tools not only for the general manager but for the people that work for him or her. But that's kind of how it is now, right? So general managers do have some obviously some institutional knowledge that will span maybe lifespans that are a little bit different than head coaches.
Yeah, and it's amazing because I do want to set the tone here a little bit. So everyone comes in. Usually it's the owners, of course, the head coaches and the general managers and their families, and then some of the high-level execs, right? So it's at the Biltmore. Think about this. During the day, there are meetings with the general managers, head coaches, and all the management. Everyone has their meetings. Again, not only the meetings around the owners together, but there's marketing meetings. There are all kinds of things going on. The families are usually outside by the pool, hanging out with the kids. And every once in a while, you get some vagrant GMs or vagrant head coaches who decide they're not going to join the meetings. And they may go out and have a pop 2, 3, or 4. And then you run into them later on in the night and you're like, where were you? Why weren't you at that meeting? And they're like, I had someone else sitting in on that meeting for me. So every once in a while that happens. But know this. This is the place where there is a lot of discussions going into the draft, right? You're around the pool having a couple cocktails together, you're having a cigar, or you're having dinner with some of your contemporaries, and you start your draft day trade discussions, or you continue them. So it's a really cool place to have a lot of really interesting conversations. You get a chance to also meet with the owners, which is also important because you can always work on making sure that your relationships from team to team are thriving.
So yeah, really cool. And so, yeah, you get to hear, right? I think everybody thinks about this idea of the draft being this, wheeling and dealing kind of where you walk, like it's sort of, you think about fantasy football, you come in, you sit down, you log into the provider, you draft for a little bit, you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants. But obviously, everybody knows this. There's a great deal that goes into it. Thomas, you and I talked about quarterbacks last week. We're going to talk about running backs on Wednesday. There's preparation with respect to that's been ongoing for months. But when it comes to even like trades, we already saw a big trade executed this past week, 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry, when Carolina moved up to 1 with Chicago. We've also seen, and this is kind of interesting as well, when you think about the league meetings, getting everybody up to speed on league trends, right? So Cleveland goes ahead and they give a second round pick to the Jets for kind of a second round wide receiver, Elijah Moore out of Ole Miss, who's kind of been a bust. And the funny thing is, of course, the Jets give back a third, right? So it's a second and third pick swap in lieu of, to get Elijah Moore. So you think about this from like the Jets perspective, you're sort of saving face, right? Because you get a second round pick back for a second round pick, but you're really not, right? Cleveland's getting back. It's about the equivalent of a 5th round pick if you add it all up. This is not something that has traditionally happened except for maybe the last 4 or 5 years, right? Those trends, you think about void years, we're going to write about void years on the website over the next week or so, like all the league-wide stuff that changes and evolves, right? It's usually one team that kind of starts the trend, and then at these things like the league meetings or the combine, basically any place where the intelligentsia of the league congregates, that's when you get the propagation of some of these new things. So right now, you're probably seeing the evolution of football. A couple of things we're going to be talking about 2 or 3 years from now are originating right here in Arizona.
Yeah, and I love the pick swap thing is so true, right? Let's just hit on that for a half a minute. When you're a general manager, man, you always you say you don't care what anyone else thinks. It's all about your organization. You're damn right you care about what people think. You care about what your owner thinks. You care about what your building thinks. And as much as you don't want to admit it, you do care about your media and fan base, because the last thing you need, your owner, is to be peppered by all of the so-called fan base about how bad you are as a general manager and how you're not thinking. So people say they don't care, they care, they're human. Now I'm not saying they're driven by it, but they do think about the best case scenario. If they do something, it's looked upon as favorable. And this pick swap idea is something that has worked well. And the last thing before we go on, you're exactly right. all of these discussions that are had at these meetings, oftentimes they'll talk about them within these big meetings. It could just be the GM meeting together. It could be the GMs and the head coaches, and there's discussion. It could be the competition committee, or it could be the general manager's advisory committee. People begin to talk. In no way is it collusion. It's just discussion. It's about professional development. How do you do this? Why are you doing this? What's the way to approach this? It is really fascinating. And there's so many different ideas from so many different people. When you get around the really smart ones like the Bill Belichick's of the world, and you get an opportunity to hang out there for a few minutes and listen to him opine and others, man, you better put it in the bank, because it's valuable.
I don't know if you've ever, I've read the book, The Big Short, right, by Michael Lewis, one of the great writers of all time. Michael Lewis, by the way, has a penchant for writing books that end up being pretty good movies, where usually the movie is kind of a crappier version of the book. But in the movie, The Big Short, they have this like really interesting set of scenes where they go to Vegas for a conference, right? And I think about this because they're essentially talking about selling each other things, but sort of how to sell each other the same things that they've always been selling each other, but how to package them in different language, right? And so for what's really funny here is the pick swap thing. It's like you're really trading Elijah Moore for a 5th round pick, right? Like that's ultimately what you're doing, right? And you would always do that. But now it's actually, no, we're gonna trade the exact same assets effectively, but we're gonna name them different things, right? And that's all what this, whenever you're in and it's not collusion, but whenever you're in a situation where there are buyers and sellers, one of these set of innovations, right? And again, we talk about void years, are the same thing. Like a 1 year, $13 million contract is now a different thing when it's $6.5 million this year, and then the rest of it tacked on to 3 more void years, right? Again, you're trying to find different ways to package the exact same thing up. And that's exactly what this pick swap is. And that's exactly why, to your point, Thomas, I think it's funny, right? Because when you're on the show, you talk about my friend Les Snead, my friend, all throughout the league, Ernie Accorsi, guys like that you've basically worked against, in many cases worked for, talk about them as your friends. Well, you have to do business with these people, and you can't be a prick. You can't be a guy that goes behind their back. You can't, a lot of this is learning how to sell assets that have different value for you than they have for somebody else, even though the market value for them is roughly the same, right? And that's a big part of this whole thing.
And Eric, we've talked about it, but I mean, this is a great time to revisit it. You have to do business, like you said. You have to get along with people. You don't have to be kissing their ass and all of that stuff. I'm not talking about that. You have to be real. You have to be authentic in your approach. You have to be trustworthy. Because if you screw someone one time in the league in today's world, this is very different than 30 years ago. People would jam it up and then move on, and they would never care. In today's world, there's no way. I remember having those early conversations with Howie Roseman. And Howie, I was saying to Howie, I'm like, this was when we were early in the bargaining business. And I've joked with him before about, and you guys have heard that story before, about wanting to trade every time he wanted to trade me, he wanted a 2nd rounder. And I said, this is not as
well. He obviously read, by the way, the research of Richard Thaler, a Nobel Prize winning economist, and Cade Massey, who you met a number of times actually over the last, who is a professor at Penn, who wrote the paper that said 2nd round picks are have the most surplus value. Of course, Howie turns around and tries to use that before you guys all catch up, which is a really good story.
The point was, you're exactly right. It's incredibly intelligent, but people caught on quickly, and you can't just do that for everything, right? My point is, Howie is a very good negotiator. But part of negotiating in our league is to make sure that people want to pick up the phone. I swear to God, our listeners will get a kick out of this. There are certain people on draft day or before the draft, I'd pick up the phone right away and I'd say, Kevin Colbert or Howie Roseman or whoever, Les Snead, I'm ready to trade. There are other guys out there, and I won't mention the name right now. If you get me a cocktail or two one day, maybe I will mention the name. But there are some out there that I will avoid it up and down. I won't even go to that number on the phone, right? We had the speed dials on our phone. The other thing is, rarely would I ever go in division. Some people are doing that. We've talked about that, right?
Yeah.
My point is, in the end, you have to have good working relationships. You have to communicate, and to get a deal done, you have to be trusted so that people will call you. so that people will trust that you're not going to jam it up their rear.
Well, not everybody looks at, and like, I love this discussion. We were obviously going to talk about some more topical things, but I actually want to go with this a little bit longer because everybody talks about the Jimmy Johnson trade and how, RIP to Mike Lynn, he, the Vikings general manager at the time, but Jimmy Johnson ripped Mike Lynn's eyes out for the Herschel Walker trade. And it was very clear, like very quickly, that the Cowboys got significant value and they pulled one over on the Vikings, right? If people don't remember, the Herschel Walker trade was the Vikings got Herschel Walker and a few other picks, and the Dallas Cowboys traded players that, if they were released, would turn into draft picks and high draft picks, like number 1s and 2s and 3s. And Jimmy Johnson's like, shit, we're 1-15, we're garbage. So you just cut those players. And so it ended up being like 3 1s, 3 2s, and I want to say 2 3s or something like that for Herschel Walker. Well, okay. And granted, people still traded with Jimmy, but in fact, in record levels. So maybe there's, but it at some level, and I've actually had like one of my best friends in the league, I'm not going to say his name, of course, because it's such like a good like story. And I want to, I think the sentiments there is like, I once messaged him and I was like, hey, like, you guys absolutely killed them on this trade. And he goes, well, I hope this player at least lasts a year so they'll call us back next time.
So let me add this, because what you're saying is very important as well. I'm not saying you don't get the best for your organization, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm talking about more is the mistrust of duplicitously going around people's back, trying to work deals on the backside, if you beat someone fair and square and that guy's head is completely spun around, that's their deal to deal with, right? I'm not going back to Jimmy Johnson and trading with him because he's done that. I look at Mike Lynn again, like you said, rest in peace. I look at him, that's his, he made his own bed. I'm talking about the duplicitous bull crap that happens sometimes, right, where you can't trust that guy, because every time you turn around, that GM or that head coach are going to do something to undercut you. There's the difference, of course.
Yeah, I think, but you also know though, right, that so there's the duplicitous side, which I 100% understand what you're saying. This person lying to you, right? They're saying, hey, the deal's done, and then they go around and they tell the next general manager that they have this deal in place, and they get a sweetener there, and then you're left holding the bag. But there's also this part of like, if a team is constantly like, again, like my friend, we was basically like, I hope that this player makes the team because I don't want them to think that they're always getting killed by us and they don't pick up the phone. Like that where like you want, it was so important when we got the Adolfo trade with the Detroit Lions. They're in division, and we're having a little bit of technical issues here. They're in division, right? But that trade, if you look at Adolfo Mensa's chart from the Jimmy Johnson perspective, like the Lions won that trade, like historically, and yet from like a more analytical chart, which is a little bit less downward sloping, the Vikings won that trade. And so there's like a common ground there, right? And so there is a fairly solid I think there is some I would say motivation to sort of make a deal that is beneficial for both sides, and you win kind of slightly. But I just could be naive there.
Well, look, I think maybe not. I mean, it honestly is from case to case, Eric. There are so many different cases and situations and scenarios that present themselves that would have you going one way and approaching it one way, and another time another way. Believe me, as I mentioned, I've been on sides where it's been really smooth and easy going. I've been on other sides. I mentioned Rich Eisen the other day. I said I've also been hammering my head against the wall dealing with someone that either wouldn't call me back, or I knew every time I turned around it was never straight shooting. That was a pain in the butt. Let me just say this to you, which I think is important. Some organizations, a general manager is at the front of it, leading the charge, hands on the wheel, right? Hands on the wheel, wants to be a part of the trade. It's their trade time. I mean, that was me. I would have people helping me out here and there, but I did not want 7 or 8 or 10 people within our organization calling all over the league, trying to figure out trade opportunities, speaking for us. Now, again, coming from the Patriot paradigm, we were very particular about having limited voices. I always worried about reaching out to someone and have someone else, a personnel director, or even Scott Pioli, who I trusted a lot, having a conversation with the GM, and it got sideways. I was a big believer in let me lead it. I would have people helping me. But there are other teams out there. I know Andrew Berry and the Browns. There are teams like that that have they have a whole gaggle out there trying to get the lay of the land. That wasn't something that I believed in. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but that's an important
I
thing.
think information overload is a huge problem, right? And I think one of the things that we want to help teams with at Sumer Sports is a system wherein the information is less, you're less drinking from a fire hose. Like what we're trying to be is kind of a filter in many ways, so that these things can be better codified. And if you do trust people within your staff to go out there and actually try to see what the market is on players, it doesn't necessarily come to you in 75 phone calls. It'll come to you within a tool that we're building. That's really what, I think that we're trying to do. Ultimately, we're just trying to make the information flow better, from individuals on teams to decision makers on teams. SH991 with a hi there. Mojal, I think we got our internet back in place here, but it was giving me an issue here. But yeah, we're really happy you're all here now. We've talked a lot about Lamar Jackson, Thomas, and at this point, like, for one, he said he asked for a trade on March 2nd. That was before the deadline to non-exclusive tag him. They non-exclusive tagged him. We don't know whether or not they made that decision, told him about it, then he wanted a trade, or whether the trade request precipitated it. John Harbaugh at the league meetings sounded a little bit like, I think obviously this is a little bit of a play, but he sounded a little naive about it. Like, hey, Lamar's going to be back here. We want him back. Can't wait to have him back. Things are clearly sideways between team and player. I don't see anything getting done before the draft because, the teams that could really use a quarterback are funny. They're all picking high in the draft. You don't really want to give up a high first round pick as part of either a trade or a signing of him on the non-exclusive tag. Signing him on the non-exclusive tag also out to is wanting a new quarterback, and the Ravens could always match it. So there's a lot of really touchy things here, Thomas. Like, I know we talked a lot about Lamar. I don't really want to talk about him as a player now. We all know what kind of player he is, but this situation, how difficult can this thing get for the Ravens and Jackson?
I think it can get really tough. Again, Eric DeCosta's, he's got his hands on the wheel. Speaking of hands on a wheel, and Eric is really good with it. He's strong. He's intelligent. He knows where he wants to go with it, along with John. John's in that really tough situation, having to answer to the media who are asking about this the trade idea that didn't get out. That's really uncomfortable for him. He's got to play it the right way as a head coach, of course. And then let's just go. So that's complicated, right? 32.4, right? That's the number, correct? Yep. Okay, play with that. Everything's fine. But now you fold in this whole idea where someone truly doesn't want to be there, and it's starting to get contentious, which is tough. And then, interestingly enough, you read about our friend Bill Belichick basically telling everyone, hey, back the F off. Do not talk to me about other teams' players. I don't know how many other people would approach that today, but I was reading his comments today. Bill knows how that is when you get caught up in all of your stuff, getting caught up with everyone else, right? So my point is, Harbaugh and DeCosta, man, they have a lot of stuff to face here, of course, and I'll be really, really interested to see. It's going to get more messy before it gets better, as you and I know.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a situation where, again, the Ravens have benefited a lot from him, but there's also not a ton of precedent for a player who plays the game like he does. When he rushed for 1,000 yards in 2019 for the first time, almost 2/3 of those yards were on design runs. So in a lot of ways, his rushing was a lot like a running back. Michael Vick, when he did it in 2006 for the Falcons, it was about 2/3 were on scrambles. So it's still kind of a different load that he was taking on. And so, I know the team, the Ravens are a very analytical team. I know that they have, a very good idea of the probabilities here. And they actually were very smart, I think, in applying the non-exclusive tag. I think the whole media and league overestimated the number of teams that would actually come forward initially and offer Lamar. I do want to give you a little bit of an idea, though. I think Lamar Jackson is not going to move, and this is going to be fun, for us as we build content for the draft. I don't think Lamar Jackson is going to move until after the draft. And here's the reason why. I think when you look at if a team were to sign him to an offer sheet, a few things could make that better. Let's say you're Detroit and you're picking 6th and 18th. If you were to sign him now, you would have to give him a new contract, which means you'd have to kind of finagle your cap a little bit. You'd have to get rid of Jared Goff, and then you would and you would also be foregoing taking any of those quarterbacks we talked about last Wednesday, Anthony Richardson, Will Levis, anybody beyond that. And then you would be giving up the 6th pick, which like you kind of hard earned that 6th pick. You traded Matt Stafford. You watched the Lions kind of struggle a little bit. Now, if you wait until after the draft, right, presumably you know whether or not you were able to get Anthony Richardson. You knew what the price was, or Will Levis. Again, I'm sort of spitballing here, but you knew what that price was. You knew what the opportunity cost was. You also know what your team looks like, what kind of players you were able to get in the draft. And if you acquire Lamar, that the 2 first-round picks are really a 2nd and a 3rd because you discount by a round every year. And because Lamar is a good player, you might now, instead of picking 6th and 18th, you might think you're picking 24th or 27th or 30th. And so in that regard, a lot of the teams that need quarterbacks now who are picking high in the draft might say, well, it's not politically popular to go after Lamar right now because of, the Ravens are a well-respected organization, blah, blah, blah. But after the draft, if things get even worse, we might just be the hero team that steps in and does it. And the draft picks that we give up to try to do the deal are going to be far cheaper by comparison.
Yeah, you have me going on this. Do we want to stay on Lamar for a minute, or we want to move on? Because
I just wanted to throw that out there because so I actually wanted to Sean Clement wrote a really good article for Sumer about kind of when you think about trading future picks, we've had 3 instances this year where that future pick was traded by a team at the time that was good, and then they weren't as good, so that pick is really high. So the Rams trading a pick to the Detroit Lions, the Seahawks getting a pick from Denver, and I'm blanking on the last one. But the thought did you ever think about that when you were trading? When you were trading future picks, you're like, well, I'm trading with this, or we're a good team. So if I trade, I think about the Deion Branch, when you guys traded Deion Branch to the Seahawks in 2005, right? And it's like, well, that's really only going to be like the 30th pick because the Patriots are amazing. It's not really a first-round pick. Do you ever think about it that way when you were trading draft picks?
Yeah, I think you have to. I think it happens quite often. It gets exciting when you think about that. And then the tough thing is, the bottom drops out, and all of a sudden it's a bad season, and it just stings you right in the ass, which can happen. But yes, you think about that. You there's no question.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of I just think it's very interesting. I think teams are going to get, obviously our tools at Sumer incorporate that. So that's something that we really want to help teams navigate more rigorously. Speaking of interesting, right? The first guest that we ever had on the show was Jack Easterby, right? An executive with Houston. He, I think, briefly mentioned why they traded DeAndre Hopkins to Arizona. Everybody sort of said, hey, why the hell did Houston only get a 2nd-round pick? And then, you realize that, well, you're trading contracts, right? And Arizona gave DeAndre Hopkins $27 million APY, and Houston wasn't able to commit to that, especially when they were going to commit to Watson long-term at the time. And, Hopkins goes to Arizona. He's fabulous early, but things have kind of cratered a little bit, right? So even if you look at something like yards after the catch, he's 4.5 yards per catch after the catch. His initial year in Arizona, 3.3 last year, which is 74th in the NFL. And then 2022 was 2.8, which is 86th in the NFL. So you're kind of not an explosive after the catch guy anymore. I actually looked this up. He did not have 1 reception against man coverage after week 11, which some of that is Kyler Murray getting hurt. Some of that is obviously his style of play. There have been a lot of teams that are like, Kansas City, Buffalo, teams with great offenses that are like, okay, Hopkins would be great here. He doesn't have to carry the whole load, blah, blah, blah. But he has a $19.5 million cap hit this year, 14.5 later. We should also do a podcast about what happens, when you trade players and how the new contract goes to the trading team. Generally speaking, it's all the non-prorated money ends up going to the trading team. But those are big numbers for a wide receiver who's 31. Arizona reportedly wanted a second round pick or a second or third round pick. But Brandon Cooks then went to Dallas for a fifth. And so now you have this marketplace, which is Arizona clearly wants something in place for a guy that they've invested so much in. And the market's kind of like, we're going to kind of wait for you to release him. And so we're at this standstill here, Thomas. I personally don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon, but it's a very interesting case of you're really trading for the player contract once they're a certain age and not necessarily the player's ability.
All right. So then, of course, I'm going to bring this back to the executives involved. I'm going to bring it back to Monty Ossenforth, first-time general manager, and Rand Carthon, first-time general manager. Where I'm going here is Monty wants nothing more out the gate than to impress Mr. Bidwell that he is frugal and proper with his money, right? Because we know that's where the Cardinals are. You have on the other side, you have Tennessee, who had an owner and a group who was really agitated with John Robinson because of the A.J. Brown situation, right? Let's see what we can do. Doesn't mean that person has to be the best wide receiver in the country. I still think, I hear your numbers. I still think that he's a good football player and he could help a team like Tennessee. And there's Rand, first-time general manager. He wants nothing more than out the gate to set his legacy, I think, within that fan base and with that owner, and say, let's build an offense. Let's get a receiver or two in here to have people say, wow, this guy came in and he fixed the wide receiver situation. I'm not saying the number one wide receiver. So I think you have two really interesting situations here. I guess what I'm saying, I'm not saying that this is going to happen. I would love to see it play out this way, that both Monty Ossenforth and Rand Carthon, for the respective teams, first-time general managers who both have their needs, would be able to solidify a deal here.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. I think, especially because Tennessee is kind of, now it's very, again, we think about these connections, right? Tennessee, you'd think at first blush that they're, again, we don't use the word tanking on this show. We say they're going through some things roster wise. Kevin Byard has requested a trade. They wanted to give him a pay cut. He didn't want a pay cut. That's life. And but they're putting a lot of void years onto contracts. And when you think about void years originated in Philadelphia. Andrew Berry, then Cleveland, Adolfo Mensa, San Francisco. The connection there, San Francisco to Cleveland, then Minnesota, a lot of void years. Rand Carthon in San Francisco, same time as Adolfo Mensa. So you sort of see all these guys who are using a ton of void years, how they're connected in their career paths. So void years allow for you to kind of make this decision to get a guy like Hopkins, because you can kind of push money into these years that are more or less just placeholders for players who aren't expected to be on the roster. Tennessee has that opportunity, right? And to your point, last season, they were winning with smoke and mirrors without much in the way of wide receivers because they traded A.J. Brown. They go and get Robert Woods, who was coming off an ACL, but it wasn't, anything close. Treylon Burks had his problems coming out of Arkansas. He was a little out of shape. He sustained some injuries, but you say, okay.
They missed on Julio. I wanted to tell John, no, Julio's not.
Yeah, Julio, like, to your point about Julio, like, this is like, I do a lot of Kansas City media, and a lot of people in Kansas City want DeAndre Hopkins. And I said, guys, it's the same conversation as the Julio conversation in the Chiefs, brass, right? The Chiefs don't trade for old players. They don't pay old players. And like, Julio Jones is a Hall of Famer. DeAndre Hopkins is a Hall of Famer. But they just have a principle against, trying to incorporate. You're a championship caliber team. Like, to your point about the Titans, if you're a team like the Chiefs or the Bills, you're a championship caliber team. You don't just like change your whole offense to be around a 31-year-old wide receiver. If you're the Titans, you don't have an offense yet. So you're going to do what you can, right, to get guys into the building who have ability. Another one that might make sense, Thomas, is the Bears, right? The Bears have money. They have a decent receiving core now. That's the problem, is that they got their wide receiver in DJ Moore in the trade. So that was one that made sense before. But from a money standpoint, it makes sense for them. But from a fit standpoint, it doesn't anymore.
It would be interesting. You're right. With Claypool, of course, DJ Moore, draft, getting their tight end situation in play. That would be fun. That would be fun to see it. I just quickly back to the Julio Jones and D Hop parallel. Are there parallels? There, and I would look. This is a good fold in with Beckham, right?
Yeah.
You start getting into those 30-year-old receivers. Are they still good? Yes. In the scope of it all, yes, of course they can. Do they have to watch their injury situation? Of course. Do you have to be smart about how you deal with it? The only problem that rolls in sometimes, it's not always easy for the egos of guys like Julio and D-Hop and Beckham, right? They forever believe they're the best, even when they're probably 40. And at certain things, they probably still are. They don't have the longevity, of course. And when I talk about Julio, when I talk about D-Hop, I think there's a place for them on teams. D-Hop now more. Julio, I don't even know, is even being talked about out there. Does Beckham? I mean, we'll get into Beckham because Mr. Mara talked about, hey, I'd welcome him back to the Giants. We can talk about that in a minute. Point is, older receivers, man, it's complicated. It's complicated. They can be good in certain ways.
Well, and if you're a good football team, I sort of made this, and I hope this isn't like thought of as like derogatory or whatever, but I want my receivers on a championship team to have kind of low self-esteem. I want guys like, I think about, you look at Kansas City just won the Super Bowl, right? And you look at like their catch distribution. It was like, the Jaguars game was a Kadarius Toney game, right? And then the championship game, Marquez Valdes-Scantling had one catch in the two playoff games other than the title game where he had 100 yards and a touchdown, right? Like, and you didn't hear a peep from Valdes-Scantling, oh, I want the ball, or, oh, I had a crappy game. Well, at least we won the Super Bowl. Or, I think about this, and not granted, Terrell Owens is one of the best players to ever play football. But you remember when he came back off against you guys and he had that ankle, and he went up to Trey Wingo after the Super Bowl that you guys played, and he said, I told you I could do it. That's a losing player in the Super Bowl saying, I told you I could do it, right? Like wide receiver. And that's kind of how wide receivers have to be mentally. But if I'm signing Odell Beckham to 1 year, let's transition to Odell. If I'm signing Odell to 1 year, $5 million, I need him to be okay with 0 for 0 some games because the flow of the game gets to a different wide receiver. I need him to run the defense off for a whole game from a certain position if that's what it dictates. And that was always the reason the Tyreek Hill trade made sense, because you had two alpha receivers on your team that you had to pump passes to. And like you think about your Falcons team when you won the NFC in 2016, Julio was your alpha. Yeah. It wasn't like Taylor Gabriel was getting 100 yards every game. It was like the 0, 0, 100, right? He would kill you when you weren't looking for him. If Odell's going to go play for a team, he's got to accept a role. And I think that's a really hard thing to do for a guy like Odell, where you're an amazing football player for so long. You make a ton of money. Now they're asking you to not make a lot of money and accept a role. That's a tough one.
You cannot kiss anyone's rear as a head coach. That's why guys like Bill Belichick can pull it off, as we mentioned with the Corey Dillons and the Randy Mosses back in the day. So does Brian Daboll have that presence about him? He's a tough ass. I like Brian. Brian will get into someone. You want to be here? I'm talking back to the Giants. Here's what you have to do. And if you're not in, man, don't even bother with it. And I agree with you. As a general manager, the last thing I needed was that distraction day in and day out of someone who's going to be a pain in your rear as an organization. No way. Even if you get them on a good price, I would say there were guys over the years that I said, absolutely not. Even Dan might have come up to me, or Smitty might have come up to me in those early years. I'd say absolutely not. We do not need that within our organization. Point is, you have to have a very strong, directed coach, and you can't have the head coach standing for one thing, and then you get the coordinator and the position coaches, stroking this guy. Then it's a mess. You have to be all on one wavelength.
Yeah, I think that it's so important. And this is part of like the whole like weak link team building part, right? And we always think about offensive line. We always think about secondary as being weak link, but wide receiver is a sneaky one where after you have pass catcher, like after you have a pass catcher that is good enough to like win consistently, your guys after that really have to be okay with the variance. They have to be okay with, a game here or there where they're amazing and a game here or there where they're not looked at. And to your point, like you just can't. It was one of the real things I looked at when Tampa Bay won the Super Bowl with Tom Brady. I was like, that's a lot of mouths to feed. That's Gronk. That's Mike Evans. That's Chris Godwin. That's Cameron Brate. That's Antonio Brown. That's Scotty Miller when Antonio Brown missed the NFC title game. Had a great game, right? And then he went back, and one of our guys, Jamerson Evers, he actually said this in the chat. He did nothing in the Super Bowl. Mike Evans had one catch in the Super Bowl. But they win, right? And that's obviously, and for a guy like Odell, there's always questions about whether that can be the case, because in Cleveland, there was issues with him not getting the football enough and his quarterback not being good enough and all this stuff. And he was right, but it doesn't matter if you're right sometimes if you cause a problem in the locker room. So that's one that's really a tricky. Now back, as we finish up here, back to another, superstar caliber player in his prime who is no longer. Ezekiel Elliott was cut by Dallas recently. Dallas is moving on to franchise player Tony Pollard to be the running back. Pollard was a 1,000-yard running back this past season as a reserve. Now he's going to be the starter there. Zeke, the last 3 years running the football, 4.0 yards per carry, which is a little bit less than league average, 4.1, which is about league average, and then 3.7 last year. 2018, Zeke had 28 carries of 15 yards or more. Since then, he's had 31. So we've really seen a decline. And, sometimes you could say, well, the Dallas offensive line was in decline. The offense was in decline. No. The Dallas offense in 2019 led the NFL in yards per play, right? They've been one of the more prolific offenses in 2020 when Dak was healthy. 2021, when Dak was healthy, they were a top 5 unit. They were a top 5 unit even after, if you look at the whole league. And then last year they were a little down, but still a very good offense. And Zeke was kind of like the weak link there. Now he's free, very good pass protector still, very good receiver out of the backfield still. Can he help a football team?
I do. I think he can. And I think I've been there before where you need to move on from a financial standpoint. What was it, 11 or 10? What were they saving on that move?
I think it was like 10 or 11.
10 or 11.
Yeah, his deal was 6 years, 90 all told, but it was structured a certain way.
So it's legitimate. And what you think as an organization, you're like, man, would love to keep the guy. I'm not answering for them because I'm not in the building, but I know this. He's got a presence. He everything you said he does, pass protection. He can still catch the ball. He's a good runner. He's not the top tier, as we know. But if you start thinking everything you know about the guy and you're hoping and praying, what if he saw the writing on the wall? He went out, we always used to say this, give the guys an opportunity to see what's out there in the market and then let them come back, humble a little bit, settle a little bit, not even humble, just say, look, Zeke, you come back here. We'd love to have you back here. And instead of this number, we're going to bring you back here. You can finish off your career for us. You can be a very valuable part of what we're doing. I could see him going back to Dallas. I really could. I don't know. I mean, I read all this stuff about Philly. I just don't know if he realizes he's not going to be making. I mean, what's he going to be making? Is he going to be making 3, 4?
Yeah, it's
maybe
3 to 5, and I think that people get a little bit misunderstanding about well, he's all this dead money to Dallas. Well, he's already been paid that money. He's looking for new money, but it's not going to be that much. I heard Cincinnati needs to replace Samaje Perine, who is a very effective kind of third down back. We did talk about this when we were talking about the running back position a couple weeks ago on our channel. Some of these guys really do transition nicely into kind of that third down role. You had Jarius Norwood on your team, and Cadillac Williams was kind of that player. Ronnie Brown was kind of that player, weirdly the same draft, where they kind of transitioned into more of a third down complementary back because they do all this stuff that you're good at when you're most running backs, right, Thomas, when you look at age curves, they just get worse as they get older running the ball, right? They come in about as spry as they're ever going to be.
Well, okay, let me just add, I remember I was so excited about bringing in Steven Jackson. Everything about him, big old stud, right? And Steven he's a good man, and he still had value for us. But there were times when you could tell it was on the tail end of his career. But you get caught up in it sometimes when you're talking amongst the coaches, and you're like, man, we could really use this guy's leadership. We could use his experience in the locker room. He can help this young running back along. But back to what we said about the receivers, the running backs too, they want to tote the rock. They still think they have it. That's just their nature. And so, it's another situation that's not as easy. I love bringing in a veteran running back, but you have to know how to use them. And the reality is, most times they're not going to be a difference maker. Corey Dillon was a difference maker for us in New England, if anyone even remembers that name.
He was. I mean, you're talking about like a 1,600-yard back. Like that's a pretty. And but to the other part is like that was a short amount of time. That was 04, right? And then by 06, you guys had drafted Lawrence Maroney, and that was a timeshare, and the wheels kind of fell off. But you guys always did a great job in New England of like, you're talking about like Sammy Morris. You're talking about Antoine Smith was the first one, right? That was the first Super Bowl back you had, who people forget that, but he was like 1,000-yard back for the Dolphins beforehand. And, you guys kind of always did the running back position, I felt like, fairly solidly. Even like, I'm trying to remember, you had some running backs that like Ben Jarvis, Green Ellis. You had just backs that were like unheralded, right? That would come in and supplement really well. And of course, all the third down backs there. I do want to give out one comp that I like here. I actually think that he could have an LT, like LaDainian Tomlinson kind of Jets career, where, when you saw the end of that San Diego time for LT, it fell off the table fast, right? There was that whole, like, he was in the playoff game and Darren Sproles was getting carries for him. And you saw, I can't remember on NFL Films, or like the players on the defense, like, wow, he's cooked, right? He goes to New York. Sean Green was like the kind of stud running back out of Iowa, big playoffs the year before. And he kind of like complimented Sean Green really well. And like, it wasn't for a long time, but can he give you 800 yards and 50 catches? Can he give you 750 yards and 50 catches? Like, I think that might be it. And it might be someplace, like Cincinnati. Buffalo's already gotten their guy now in Damian Harris from New England. But I think that might be in Zeke's future, which, could be a beneficial run for him and could help him win. I mean, I think winning is a big part for a lot of these guys now.
It is. And I have to say this because it's been on my mind. Everyone out there, when you're educating your sons and daughters, do what the Eagers did with their son. Send them to school, big academia, get them a PhD in mathematics, and then have him be encyclopedic as he is right now. I am blown away. Every time I listen to you, I'm like, man, you're the dude I needed beside me to be tapping into things all over those years as my AGM, and then maybe it would be the transition. Here, take it.
Well, I know my ex-girlfriend from college doesn't listen to the show, but when we were in college, she once told me, she's like, Eric, I hope you can find a way to make money off of all this nonsense that you're memorizing. And here we are. But yeah, that was, it was, you love football, right? The old games are always on in the background while I'm coding. And even before then, it was just, the league has gotten more compelling, but I feel like the league was also very compelling back in the day when I'm talking about New England and all this stuff. And I got to be honest, like, I always rooted for New England because I love dynasties. And like I grew up kind of in that middle of like the Cowboys and the Niners and stuff where you're like, I like teams being able to stack trophies. And, I always found the Patriots to be kind of like, okay, if they're doing something, like I got to reverse engineer why. And that required like learning a lot of obscure players, right? Because you talk about Corey Dillon. They failed a lot of times, like Joey Galloway, Ojo Cinco, like, and like that, is, that's part of it. Like all the cutting room floor includes a lot of these guys. So,
look, what you're saying is so cool, and I agree with you. And there is some passionate about some of those old names and mixing them in, being able to draw. And just so everyone knows, I mean, I used to say this all the time. I'd say it to my college and pro directors. I'd say, look, you're the one that needs to be the go-to people regarding names, not just because you can pop names. I want you to pop names out, but I also want you to compare. You're bringing someone to me as a general manager and you're saying it's, Corey Dillon, like, I want to know that you're paralleling them well, because that is a really good way to put your team together when you're comparing players. It can be 10, 15 years before. It could be 2 years away. All I'm saying is there's a lot of discussion. Head coaches, general managers always want comparatives. That we've said that so many times in Sumer, right? You guys get sick and tired of me saying that, but if I'm saying what a GM's saying is like, give me legit comparables.
Well,
And
there's a very good movie. So a couple things, right? Like there's a very funny movie that I remember from a kid called Road Trip, and one of the guys in the movie, he's like, "Can I teach you? I think it's like American history before your test." He's like, I can teach you anything as long as I know how to relate the material." Like that's as long like learning about the future is just about trying to relate it to everybody's past. And like you think about why Sumer exists, it's because Paul Tudor Jones and Jack have this, portfolio optimization background, and they view football as that kind of problem. Now, as we know, it's not perfectly that way, but it's and so we draw from their expertise in that area, and they draw from our expertise in other areas. And like, we have people that work for us at Sumer that are from baseball or basketball and like other fields. And like I do a lot of my reading now in basketball analytics and soccer analytics because I've kind of done as much football analytics as I might end up doing. And so I'm trying to draw from them. And it's all about relating new material to your past.
Well, I would say you go in there, anyone who's come rising through the ranks, if you're a middle manager at a team right now, or you have this quest to be that way, the quickest way to lose any validity when you're going to interview for a GM job or an AGM job or personnel director job is to not have context and not have historical understanding. I would say that to anyone right now. If you're looked upon, this kid doesn't know the past 5 years, it's a very quick way to not differentiate yourself. If you want to differentiate, be smart about the history, do more reading in the off season, and so that you can, so that you have some background to dig into. I think
Jameis and I will be in Atlanta for the draft. No KC, although I love KC. Thomas, I don't know, you didn't get a chance to play KC as much being from the NFC in your time. KC's a great place to be. The draft is very lucky to be there. A lot of Sumer will be in Atlanta. A lot of Sumer will be in Palm Beach, which will be fun. But we will have content, including Wednesday, where we will talk about running backs. I've got some sort of graphics that we're going to work on, looking at kind of 40-yard dashes, looking at speed, looking at some historical data on. We're going to look at 4 or 5 running backs on Wednesday, so that's going to be fun. We hope to see you there. If all things work with Thomas's travel, we're thinking about 7:00 again Eastern. If you like what you've heard on this show already, somebody made fun of me for this, but we're going to ask for it. Hit the like button, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get alerts every time we go live. If you're listening to us on a podcast, please hit the like button, subscribe, rate, and review. Those reviews mean a lot to us, especially the 5-star ones. This has been a lot of fun, Thomas. It's always fun, like when we kind of don't really have an agenda and we just talk football. I think that those are our favorite podcasts. I think people, generally speaking, agree with us. So this has been a good time, Thomas. I hope you have a fun time tonight hanging out with some of your friends in Arizona. So for Thomas Dimitrov, this has been Eric Eager. This has been the Sumer Sports Show.